The next two sections that we're going to take a look at will be roles and also security in the Moralis server. We'll start with security first because roles will eventually feed into the security side. And the Moralis server gives you a number of different ways in which you can secure your data. The first way that you can secure your data is by using keys. So for example, when you're initializing your Moralis instance, you'll be using an application ID. We've also seen in other parts of the course that there are some functions that require a master key. So this concept of keys exists in Moralis. And of course, keys are like top-level admin passwords. You should never share this with anybody. And ideally, you should never share this in your source code. Any user was to go and view the page source, they would be able to very easily look down your JavaScript and find that your keys appear automatically in the code. Now, of course, I've just written everything in vanilla JavaScript. And if you're using React or another framework, you'd be able to hide these keys somewhere else. But it just goes to show that this sort of information is publicly accessible unless you protect it. So the Moralis server does give you other ways in which you can secure your data. And there are two main ones which would be covered in this part of the course. The first one will be class level permissions, and the next one will be object level permissions. So we'll think about it as class level permissions as CLP, and object level or access control lists as ACL. So if you remember when we were creating new classes, new tables in our database, you didn't have to manually go ahead and create the class. It was automatically generated for you when you added a unit. And by standard, this unit class is publicly available to both read and write. So whenever a new class is created, it automatically provides permissions to the public. And I can show you the class permissions by going to security, class level permissions. And you can see here that the public automatically get access to read, write, and add fields. Now, you might not want this, and it would be the same for the users. So for example, let's say you had 1,000 users using your application. If you haven't changed any of the permissioning for this user class, then by default, a specific enough query would be able to look inside of your user database and find out how many users you have. And maybe you don't want that behavior. Maybe you don't want the ability for people to do that. But Moralis gives you the option to switch that off. So for example, you could uncheck read, save that as a CLP, and that will now mean that nobody will be able to read information from your user table. But what about if there is a profile page in your application? What about if this user here, tester, wants to know information that's stored about their account? Now that we've switched off the public read access, no one will be able to access it unless they've been given specific permission to do so. We go back to class level permissions. We can click this icon up the top right and choose the advanced mode, and you'll see that there are actually more operations in here that we can effect. So for example, under the read category, well, read takes care of the get, the find, and the count. So you could individually set these if you wanted to. Write takes care of create, update, and delete. So you could remove or edit any one of those. And of course, the add side of things would be adding fields. So what you might want to do is to allow the public to get information. For example, if they have a specific enough user ID or an object ID, but maybe you don't want them to be able to just publicly search or find information in that database. Maybe what you want is to have a specific role, like administrators, that do have full privileges. Maybe you want a specific user ID to be able to have full privileges. This is where you would be able to set that if you wanted to. For now, I'll just cancel this. There's a video here talking through Moralis database security. After this video, I'd recommend pausing the course and taking a look through that. But essentially, you just need to be aware that the Moralis functionality out of the box does require some configuration, especially if you want to take it to production. We've got some suggestions for some defaults and precautions, and we'll run through those together now. So we're going to be talking you through how to set up class level permissions and access control lists, which will be your application security mechanisms. But just remember that the master key would be able to override those. So really what you want to do is restrict the amount of power that the public have over your data, but you would use the master key inside of your cloud function code. As a rule of thumb, that's often going to be the best solution. So class level permissions would be the first one. After this video, take a look through this security video from Nicholas. It would be like a blanket permissioning across the entire table in your database. And probably every class inside of your database could benefit from having these permissions tweaked to some degree. When we looked in the database a moment ago, we looked at the different types of operations that fell under read and write. Get was able to fetch objects in the table if the object ID was known. Finding is a permission that enables the querying of all of the objects in the table. So it's quite common to disable the find, but continue to allow get to the public. When it comes to writing, it's quite common to disable write for the public, or maybe just specifically provide access to a role of people, like administrators, for example. It's also quite common to disable adding fields to the public, because once the app is live, it's pretty rare that someone needs to add fields to your table. You're able to grant permissions to certain users if you wish to, or completely lock down permissions on all of these operations. So when a user is trying to complete one of these operations, it will run up against the class level permission. If it fails the class level permission, it will not be able to complete one of these operations. But if it passes the class level permission, then it will run into the object level access permissions, which will be the access control lists. That's the next layer of security. The object level would be every individual item within the database. So we've looked at a blanket permission for the whole class, but you can also have access control lists for each individual item inside of your database. We click on this one, for example. This is how we could edit an access control list. And again, you can edit the read or the write access. You could add a specific user, or you could add a specific role once you've created one, like an administrator. And what will often happen when you're creating items for your database is that you will create an access control list there and then at that moment. That would be best practice. So take a read through this information here on access control lists. If we're doing it with code, you get the current user object, store it in user, and then you use the setACL method and run a new Moralis.acl and pass in the user object. So if we head over to the unit table in the database, you'll notice here that each one of the units, no ACL was set. So it is just set to public read and public write by default. So the class level permissions are set to public read and write, and the access control list is set to publicly read and write. Now, if I went to the user table and just change, like I have with these two, the ACL for the users to public read and write, you'll notice that one of them is different here, because what happens is when you log in, when a user logs into your application, this ACL will automatically be set. So whilst you can change it in the database, it will be overwritten when somebody logs into the application. So let's try and log in with a different user here. A3 is the Ethereum address. So I'll try and log in with this address instead. And then if I go to the database, refresh, there you go. So you can now see that this access control list has been reset just by re-authenticating and signing back in. So overwriting the ACL in the user database is probably not the best thing to do, because it'll be overwritten when the user logs back in. But your own custom classes won't have that behavior unless you set it. The best way to set an ACL automatically in code is by using cloud code and triggers, which we've not yet covered. But essentially, you're asking the server to listen to whenever a new user is created, and before the user is saved, create an ACL. And then you would use some code that would look similar to this, create an instance of Moralis.acl, and then you would set the public read access to true or false, set the write access, which would mean that everybody has access here. You could set individual write access to the logged in user's ID and set that user to true. It will mean that only that user will have write access and no one else. So how do we set the ACL to an item in our table? And how do we do that with code? Well, you'd have to go to the function wherever you're creating your object. Now, in an ideal world, you'd be doing this using cloud code rather than on the front end, but I won't be using cloud code, and this will just demonstrate how it's done. So in my create, this is a class method that I have whenever a unit is created. In here, where I'm setting the attributes, I can now set an ACL before I save the unit. So I'll need to do two things. I'll need to go and get the Moralis user, and I'll also need to use unit, and then I'll call it set ACL method. And in there, create a new instance of the Moralis.acl. And I'll pass in the user object. But I need to get the user object, so I can just create that. And we'll save it like this. And now each time this unit is saved, it will have created, it will set the ACL as the user object. So when we go and look at creating a new item, it should now have disabled the public read and write access and only allow read and write access for this specific user. So let's save that and we'll go to the front end and we'll test it. We'll run create get unit. It's run this. So now if we just go straight to the database and refresh, we should now see, here we go. The very first one that we've created, it now has an ACL. And if we click in there, public read and write is disabled. And this particular user, which is this particular user here, if we click that user pointer, that's the Ethereum address that ends in EA3. So if I come back to my front end, have a look at who I'm logged in as. I'm logged in as EA3. So I'll just run this moralis.user.current and we'll get the ETH address. And you can see it's EA3. By adding that piece of code into the create unit function, we have now added an ACL to each and every unit that is created. So we could run that multiple times. I'll just click that a few times. I'll just refresh the dashboard, go down to the units table. We can see there's now 48 units rather than 40, and each one of them have that created. And if I just go and log out and log in as another one, log out, sign in, just change the account. So now I'm logged in with a different account here. I'll go and press this a few times, go over to our dashboard, refresh, and we'll have a look and see that each one of these now has a different ACL to this one. So if we did a query, we'll be able to find all of the public read and write ones down here, but the individual user that's doing the search will only be able to find the ones which its user ID matches the ACL. And the code that I added was simple. It was just using the user ID, and we've just created a new ACL. We didn't set individual read or write access. We just gave all access to that user. If you wanted to set different ways, then you could use this idea here. This example is setting public read access and setting write access. Of course, you also have public write access and also set read access. And that gives you an idea of how you would be able to set object related or access control lists. Now, what Moralis doesn't do is support column level permission access, which means that you can't expose movement points and ranged, but maybe hide hit points and abilities. This particular class, if you had specific fields that you wanted to hide from your user, then you'd need to create a different class and have that class as completely protected, and this one would be readable. So you'd need to split the data up into different classes. And to summarize what we've done here, typically your class level permissions will be done inside of the dashboard. Your access control lists will be done on an object level, and that should be done in code. And more often than not, that will be done using cloud functions. Now, this example actually shows a new method called set role write access. There would also be set role read access, and that's based on roles which we have yet to come back to. And there are some examples here that are worth reading through for ACLs and class level permissions. And below there's a bit more information about the format of an ACL if you're interested in learning a little bit more, and some details about pointer permissions and requires authentication permission, and a bit of an explanation about the examples above. But really, we've just got to be aware that CLP and ACLs interact, and you need to be able to pass both of them in order to get access to the data that you're looking for. You'll need to pass the class level permission, and you'll need to pass the access control list. Otherwise, the request will be rejected. There's a bit more information about that here. And here are some special classes in Moralis that don't always follow those rules. So if we take a look at find, for example, it says normal behavior footnote 3. So it's basically saying that the read ACLs don't apply to the logged in user. So you might disable read access on all objects in a table, but the user that's logged in will still be able to find their details. However, if you disable finding in the class level permissions, it's still going to return an error. And there's some other examples here that's worth looking through and familiarizing yourself with. If for whatever reason you come across one of those cases that's unusual, then you can use cloud code and just use your master key, because you'll be able to bypass the ACL or the CLPs. Because cloud function code, as we'll find out shortly, is very, very useful for validation. So for example, if there's some invalid data that's going to attempt to be stored in your database, then cloud code could weed that out. And validation functions will typically be using triggers, before save, typical examples. And we'll be looking at cloud code shortly. Validation is important for security. You want to make sure that only certain values are accepted and that the data is sanitized correctly. But it's not just validation that you can do with cloud code. You might also want to bypass certain class level permissions or access control lists for certain functions. And the example in the documentation here is, let's say you've locked down permissions for a user to write to, let's say, a post object, but you can, using cloud code, allow them to like a post, which is a write function if you like. And you would do that using the master key. You can write as many cloud functions as you need, and you'd be able to call that function from the front end if you needed to. Moralis does allow the user to modify the database by creating new classes and changing the structure of the existing classes in the database. The Moralis server settings does allow you to switch that facility off. You might want to consider that if you're taking your application into production. Otherwise, a user could technically fill up your database with all types of new classes. So there's a number of ways that you can secure your database. You'll still be able to use your master key to bypass any other features that you put in place, but access control lists and class level permissions are well worth setting when you're ready to put your application into production. At this stage, I'd recommend going back up to the top of this section and look at both of the videos that you saw at the beginning. First of all, the Moralis database security, and then the Moralis object security. And then we'll head back over to roles.